Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Pond's mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman. And together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You'll find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at doingsofdoyle.com on Blue Sky. Hello everyone, and welcome to this bonus episode, which we're releasing as a companion to our show on a pastoral horror. Now, unfortunately, you are without the dulcet tones of Paul this time, but I'm not alone because you're about to hear an interview with Philipp Schöbi, a Doylean scholar based in Austria, who's undertaken excellent work on what's believed to be Conan Doyle's first publication, a school newspaper called the Feldkirchian Gazette. Now, my GCSE German can only take me as far as the Tourist Information Office, so I've enlisted the help of Marcus Geiser, like Philip, an excellent Doylean scholar, who's kindly acted as our translator. So what you're about to hear is a few seconds of Philip before Marcus takes over. And for German speakers, we've included Philip's full answers in his native tongue at the end of the episode. So let's get started. Philipp Schöbi was born in Switzerland and lives today in Feldkirch in Austria. He's a doctor of mathematics and a former high school teacher, and has written on advanced geometry, literature, and the history of science. For many years, he was the director of the theatre group at the Diogenes Theatre Altstetten and a writer of the cabaret group Altstädter Symphoniker. A member of the literary group at the Theater am Saumarkt Feldkirch since 1991, he co-founded and co-organized the Feldkirch Literature Days, which have been held annually since 1994. He's the author of Literary Feldkirch, and earlier this year he was awarded the Blue Carbuncle by the German Sherlock Holmes Society for his work on Arthur Conan Doyle and Feldkirch. Philip, welcome to the podcast. Now, how did you come to be interested in Conan Doyle and his time in Feldkirch?
Nun, ich wusste schon lange, dass Conan Doyle für ein Jahr in Feldkirch zur Schule ging.
Well, I had known for a long time that Conan Doyle went to school in Feldkirch for a year, 1875 to 1876, and had already gathered some information about this. The Feldkirchian Literature Days have been held since 1994, and it was time to finally dedicate them to Arthur Conan Doyle. The 150th anniversary of his birth in 2009 provided us with an excellent and unique opportunity to do so. Since at least 1975, more than 50 years ago, an unchallenged and unquestioned legend has been circulating in the Vorarlberg that Conan Doyle wrote short stories for the weekly newspaper Feldkircher Anzeiger during his school year 1875 to 1876 at the Stella Matutina Jesuit school in Feldkirch. However, I was not aware of any evidence to support this legend. And as we know, repeating a legend over and over again does not make it any more true. For example, in 1975, the Vorarlberger Nachrichten, the largest local daily newspaper, published a full-page article on the 13th of March entitled Mr. Sherlock Holmes Studied in Feldkirch, about Conan Doyle's one-year stay at the Stella. It contained a great deal of interesting, insightful, and accurate information. However, it also categorically claimed that Conan Doyle had written for the Feldkircher Anzeiger. For example, it states that one of the stories published in the Anzeiger, entitled Ein schlauer Betrüger, a clever swindler, was set in London and bore, quote, his unmistakable signature, end of quote. For example, the signature of Conan Doyle. Well, when you read this short story, which begins unremarkably and ends quite differently than you would have expected, you might actually think it was penned by Conan Doyle, who was, however, only 16 years old at the time in Feldkirch. We had also invited the Cologne-based Sherlock Holmes expert Michael Ross, who runs Baskerville Bücher in Germany, to our 2009 Literature Days. Through online research, Michael discovered that the story in question, entitled Ein schlauer Betrüger, a clever swindler, and supposedly bearing Conan Doyle's unmistakable signature, had already appeared in a Prague entertainment magazine in 1837, 22 years before Conan Doyle's birth, albeit under a different title. Well, that would have been the first known example of prenatal literature. I don't really believe that such a thing is possible. It was clear to me that Conan Doyle could not have written that story. However, there were other reasons why I ruled out the possibility that Conan Doyle could have written stories in German for publication at the age of 16. This was particularly evident from his surviving letters from Feldkirch to his mother Mary, in which he reported on his progress in German, among other things. But I was still left wondering how this false legend that Conan Doyle had written for the Feldkirchian Anzeiger had come about in the first place. And that brings us to his school newspaper, the Feldkirchian Gazette, which he wrote in Feldkirch. Conan Doyle had sent the school newspaper to his literary-minded godfather, Michael Conan, in Paris, who praised him highly in a letter to his mother Mary for his Feldkirch newspaper. There can be no doubt of his faculty for that accomplishment. In each one of his more serious inspirations, I found passages of thoroughly original freshness and imaginative refinement. It seems to me that he is in excellent spirits. His Feldkirch newspaper gives capital promise, and I suspect that it is his own from first to last. This passage from the letter with his Feldkirch newspaper, which was very significant for the author's literary development, found its way into the first authorized biography of Conan Doyle, The Life of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle by John Dickson Carr, a friend of the Doyle family. Subsequently, a large number of other biographies adopted this passage from the letter, or at least its core message, without clarifying that it was not a public newspaper at all, but merely a school newspaper. I'm convinced that this is precisely what later led to what we consider to be the undoubtedly erroneous legend that Conan Doyle wrote for the Feldkirchian Anzeiger during his stay in the Montfortstadt.
Tell us about the Feldkirchian Gazette. What is it? How many were there? What sort of things did it include?
Die von Conan Doyle herausgegebene Publikation, the Feldkirchian Gazette.
The publication, the Feldkirchian Gazette, edited by Conan Doyle, was a student newspaper founded for the benefit of his English-speaking fellow students, as Conan Doyle himself later stated in a long overview article on his career to date. Article by John Ernest Hodder Williams, published in 1902. The newspaper was in English and was supposed to be published monthly. In that overview article, however, Conan Doyle also revealed that his Feldkirchian Gazette had a short and somewhat checkered existence and came to an untimely end. In other words, contrary to his plans, his school newspaper was discontinued, probably on the instructions of the school management. In fact, only 2 issues of the newspaper have been preserved in the family estate, October and November 1875. In the case of the November issue, only the first pages exist, in the form of Conan Doyle's handwritten original manuscript, which is now kept at the British Library in London. I suspect that no further issues followed after these two. The October issue contains 10 articles, 7 of which are by Conan Doyle and 3 by 2 other authors. 5 articles from the fragmentary November issue have been preserved, only one of which is not by Conan Doyle. Of these 15 articles, 11 are by Conan Doyle, all but one, which he wrote in rhyming verse form. Many of the contributions deal with school situations, some of them in a critical manner. Sports such as football and cricket are a recurring theme. Incidentally, football was first played in Austria at the Jesuit grammar school Stella Matutina in Feldkirch, thanks to the English boys who brought the sport here. The contributions also deal with topics such as the anxiety-filled reading of the notes, rebellion against authority, and the bombardon, a type of bass tuba played by Conan Doyle in the school brass band and clearly loved by him. I was particularly amazed by the sophisticated and serene confidence, indeed brilliance, with which the then 16-year-old schoolboy Conan Doyle parodied literary works by his admired authors Sir Walter Scott and Lord Thomas Babington Macaulay in some of his texts. For example, a battle in Scott's work becomes a hard-fought football match. This alone demonstrated the great literary potential lying dormant in the boy. In this context, I would also like to mention that Conan Doyle had something of a literary awakening in Feldkirch, where the boy first came across a book by Edgar Allan Poe that, I quote, not only impressed him but electrified him. It is an original quote from John Dickson Carr's biography. Namely, tales of mystery, imagination, and humor. In later years, Conan Doyle admitted that no author except Macaulay and Scott had influenced his taste of literary inclinations as much as Poe. Incidentally, Conan Doyle even illustrates one of his contributions entitled A Feldkirch Drama with his own cartoons. I would also like to point out a curious detail here. On the front page of the November issue of his school newspaper, Conan Doyle had noted the so-called third binomial formula in the top right-hand corner. This was probably just a reminder, as it is unlikely that he took the handwritten manuscript of his newspaper with him to math class to use as a cheat sheet during exams. However, the formula he wrote down may have also symbolized the tough battle Conan Doyle fought in Feldkirch with the pitfalls of mathematics and logic. But his in-depth study of logic at Stella would ultimately sharpen his mind for those special deductive skills that characterize his later fictional hero, the detective Sherlock Holmes.
Of Conan Doyle's many contributions to the Gazette, which do you think are the most important and why?
Zunächst einmal sein allererstes Gedicht in der Oktoberausgabe, in dem uns
First of all,
einen
his very first poem in the October issue, in which he immediately provides us with a programmatic outlook for his project and announces that he will use the Gazette to brave this dreary year in the midst of surges loud of the angry sea, cheering us up month after month with its light. I quote, "As the bright light that pierced the cloud, so may our paper be. And as the ship mid surges loud breached the angry sea, so ever through the dreary year, when nothing else is bright, may the Gazette each month appear to cheer us up with its light." This is immediately followed by the poem Verses, a parody of the ballad Lays of Ancient Rome by Thomas Macaulay, a poet he admired. In it, Conan Doyle's real-life school friend Wilfred Edward Lomax becomes a hero on the football field as a goalkeeper. In his poem A Horrible Tale, the 16-year-old Conan Doyle already shows a glimpse of his dramatic talent by first leading the reader down the wrong track only to surprise them with a twist at the end. The whole thing is seasoned with a dash of cheeky British humour. I quote, "All in the midst of the busy crowd, I saw an old man stand. He heeded not the bustle loud, a spade was in his hand. Though his hair was white and his form was bowed, yet he dug through the earth and sand. I looked upon his face so pale, for pale as death was he. I said, Alas, what fearful tale, what horror here may be! The hidden secret I will unveil, I will solve the mystery." Another key contribution is probably the one titled The Reading of the Notes, in which he pokes fun at a Jesuit priest named Pipes and his frightening behavior. In his last contribution to the October issue of Two Contributors, he thanks his colleagues and encourages them to continue to work so that they may use the Gazette to be a proof of English civilization in this savage land. End of quote. However, Conan Doyle would soon become fond of this savage foreign land, as he confessed in his memoirs when looking back to Stella Matutina, and I quote again, "Here the conditions were much more humane, and I met with far more human kindness than at Stonyhurst, with the immediate result that I ceased to be a resentful young rebel and became a pillar of law and order." Later, his famous fictional character Sherlock Holmes was also destined to become a pillar of law and order. For me, one of the absolute highlights of Conan Doyle's writings is his introduction to the second edition of the Gazette in November, which is nothing less than a passionate declaration of freedom of the press, and that 150 years ago by a Scottish boy who was just 16 years old. Many of today's erratic, power-hungry politicians could learn a thing or two from him. I quote, "Where the seething waves of ocean in their fierce contention roll, from the rock-bound northern limits to the frozen southern pole, there is one great power that sways us, ancient, mighty, and sublime, one dread weapon that dismays us, reverenced in every clime. Tyrant kings have oft denied it. Soon their fears they must confess. None who ever yet have tried it faced the freedom of the press." In his poem A Feldkirch Football Match, Conan Doyle skillfully parodies the historical verse novel Marmion, A Tale of Blood and Field by Sir Walter Scott, the creator of Ivanhoe, whom he greatly admired. As already mentioned, a battle on the battlefield is transformed into a fiercely contested football match. However, one of my favorite texts by Conan Doyle in his Gazette is the Song of the Bombarden, a paean to the bombarden, a type of large bass tuba which he played enthusiastically in the Stella brass band.
Now, you've managed to find out a lot about Father Baumgartner, who we've mentioned several times on the podcast. Tell us a little about him. How significant do you feel he was on Conan Doyle's development as a person and as an author?
Conan Doyle beschrieb seinen 7-jährigen Aufenthalt im englischen
Conan Doyle
Jesuitenkonvent.
described his 7-year stay at the English Jesuit school Stonyhurst before he came to Feldkirch as an extremely unhappy time in retrospect. It was only in his final school year, 1874 to 1875, that he blossomed when he suddenly discovered his special literary talent. That year, the Jesuit priest Alexander Baumgartner, born in 1847 and died in 1910, who was highly educated in literature and well known for his humor, had also joined the school as a teacher of modern languages, German, Italian, and French. As Conan Doyle reported in a letter to his mother Mary, he greatly enjoyed Father Baumgartner's German lessons. Just how much can be gauged from the fact that Conan Doyle later immortalized his former German teacher Baumgartner in 3 of his stories as Baumgarten, an honor that, to my knowledge, no other former teacher of his received. Father Baumgartner came from the Swiss canton of St. Gallen, which borders Vorarlberg, and, like his famous father and senior politician Gallus Jakob Baumgartner, was a citizen of the Swiss town of Altstetten, which borders Feldkirch. Feldkirch and Altstetten are incidentally the only neighboring towns in Austria and Switzerland. Above all, however, Father Baumgartner had himself been a pupil and later a teacher at the Jesuit grammar school Stella Matutina, which he remembered fondly throughout his life. To my knowledge, Father Baumgartner was also the only teacher at Stonehurst at that time who had a personal connection to Stella Matutina. It therefore stands to reason that it was Father Baumgartner who suggested to Stonyhurst headmaster Purbrick, Father Edward Ignatius Purbrick, from 1813 to 1914, to recommend that the gifted pupil Conan Doyle, after completing his secondary education at Stonyhurst, spend a further school year at the Stella Matutina in Feldkirch in order to improve his German language skills. Father Baumgartner must have also impressed Conan Doyle because he not only had a wide-ranging literary knowledge of several languages, but was also on friendly terms with Sir Walter Scott's close family circle. What Conan Doyle could have not known at the time, of course, was that his former German teacher Baumgartner would later publish a 10-volume history of world literature and rise to become the undisputed literary authority of the Catholic Church, the so-called Catholic Pope of literature, and that his teacher would even be nominated 3 times for the Nobel Prize in Literature. So, in Stonyhurst, Conan Doyle and Baumgartner were 2 people who would go on to become world-renowned luminaries in their respective fields. I'm convinced that Conan Doyle's encounter with his German teacher Baumgartner at Stonyhurst was decisive and groundbreaking for him as a person and for his future literary career.
We're really pleased to be able to host the English language version of your article on the website. But where can listeners find your other scholarship?
Über das Schuljahr von Conan Doyle in Feldkirch habe ich ausführlich in meinem 2018
I reported in
erschienenen
detail on the school year of Conan Doyle in Feldkirch in my book Das literarische Feldkirch, The Literary Feldkirch, published in 2018. I published Conan Doyle's school newspaper, the Feldkirchian Gazette, in its entirety in 2024 in the magazine More 4, published by the Vorarlberg State Archives, to my knowledge for the first time. It is thanks to Markus Geisser and his wife Helen Dorry that the complete manuscript of the Gazette was made available to me by the British Library. Furthermore, I have published several newspaper articles about Arthur Conan Doyle.
Philip, thank you so much for your time. Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview with Philip, and my thanks again to Marcus for all his help with the translation. Have a read of Philip's article on the website, and I think you'll agree that his work is truly outstanding. He shone a light on this previously opaque period of Conan Doyle's life, but more importantly, I think he's told us something about the emergence of Conan Doyle as a writer, about how well read he was, his emerging style, and his influences. And I think you also get a sense of Conan Doyle's personality from the Feldkirchian Gazette. It certainly reads like his October issue found opposition within the Stella, and the November issue then has an edge to it that suggests a kind of youthful defiance. For a brief moment there, I think we get the sense of the public campaigner of later years who could summon up and marshal moral outrage. So thank you again to Philip for his article and for taking the time to talk to us. And hopefully this might be the start of sharing Doylean scholarship from across the world that might otherwise go unread by those of us linguistically challenged. For German listeners, remember to stay on to hear Philip's answers in full. But for now, that's all for me. So until next time, auf Wiedersehen. Philip, welcome to the podcast. Now, how did you come to be interested in Conan Doyle and his time in Feldkirch?
Nun, ich wusste schon lange, dass Conan Doyle für ein Jahr in Feldkirch zur Schule ging und hatte dazu auch schon einiges zusammengetragen. Seit 1994 gibt es die Feldkircher Literaturtage und es war an der Zeit, diese endlich einmal Conan Doyle zu widmen. Mit der 150. Wiederkehr seines Geburtstages im Jahr 2009 bot sich uns dazu eine hervorragende und einmalige Gelegenheit. Schon seit spätestens 1975, also heute vor über 50 Jahren, kursierte in Vorarlberg die unwidersprochene und nicht hinterfragte Legende, Conan Doyle hätte während seines Schuljahres 1875/76 an der Feldkircher Jesuitenschule Stella Matutina Kurzgeschichten für das Wochenblatt Feldkircher Anzeiger geschrieben. Mir waren aber zu dieser Legende keinerlei Belege bekannt, und wie wir wissen, gewinnt eine Legende auch dadurch nicht an Wahrheitsgehalt, indem man sie immer und immer wieder wiederholt. So gab es zum Beispiel in den Vorarlberger Nachrichten, der größten hiesigen Tageszeitung, bereits 1975 einen ganzseitigen Artikel mit dem Titel Mr. Sherlock Holmes studierte in Feldkirch über den einjährigen Aufenthalt von Conan Doyle an der Stella. Darin stand durchaus viel Interessantes, Aufschlussreiches und Zutreffendes. Es wurde darin aber auch unumstößlich behauptet, Conan Doyle hätte für den Feldkircher Anzeiger geschrieben. Da heißt es zum Beispiel, dass eine der im Anzeiger erschienenen Geschichten mit dem Titel Ein schlauer Betrüger in London spiele und, ich zitiere, unverkennbar seine Handschrift trüge, also die Handschrift von Conan Doyle. Nun, wenn man diese kurze Kriminalgeschichte liest, die unscheinbar beginnt und ganz anders endet, als man es erwartet hätte, könnte man tatsächlich meinen, sie sei der Feder von Conan Doyle entsprungen, der damals in Feldkirch allerdings erst 16 Jahre alt war. Nun hatten wir zu unseren Literaturtagen 2009 auch den Kölner Sherlock Holmes-Experten Michael Ross eingeladen, der in Deutschland den Baskerville Verlag betreibt. Michael fand durch Recherchen im Netz heraus, dass die besagte Geschichte mit dem Titel Ein schlauer Betrüger, die angeblich unverkennbar Conan Doyles Handschrift trage, bereits 1837, also 22 Jahre vor Conan Doyles Geburt, in einem Prager Unterhaltungsblatt gestanden hatte, wenn auch unter einem anderen Titel. Nun, das wäre das erste bekannt gewordene Beispiel von pränataler Literatur gewesen. Da ich nicht wirklich daran glaube, dass solches möglich ist, war mir klar, dass Conan Doyle jene Geschichte sicher nicht geschrieben haben konnte. Es gab aber auch noch ganz andere Gründe, weshalb ich ausschloss, dass Conan Doyle schon damals mit 16 Jahren zur Publikation bestimmte Geschichten auf Deutsch geschrieben haben könnte. Insbesondere ging das aus seinen erhalten gebliebenen Briefen aus Feldkirch an seine Mutter Mary hervor, in denen er unter anderem über seine Fortschritte in Deutsch berichtete. Für mich blieb aber dennoch die Frage, wie es überhaupt zu jener falschen Legende hatte kommen können, Conan Doyle habe für den Feldkircher Anzeiger geschrieben. Und da landen wir nun bei seiner in Feldkirch verfassten Schülerzeitung, der Feldkirchian Gazette. Conan Doyle hatte die Schülerzeitung nämlich an seinen literarisch versierten Patenonkel Michael Conan in Paris gesandt, der ihn in einem Brief an seine Mutter Mary sehr lobte für his Feldkirch Newspaper. Und dieser für die schriftstellerische Entwicklung des Autors sehr bedeutende Briefpassus mit his Feldkirch Newspaper fand Eingang in die erste autorisierte über Conan Doyle erschienene Biografie The Life of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle von John Dickson Carr, einem Freund der Familie Doyle. In der Folge übernahm eine Vielzahl weiterer Biografien diesen Briefpassus und oder zumindest dessen Kernaussage, ohne allerdings klarzustellen, dass es dabei gar nicht um eine öffentliche Zeitung ging, sondern lediglich um eine Schülerzeitung. Nach meiner Überzeugung führte genau dies später zu der unseres Erachtens zweifellos irrigen Legende, Doyle habe während seines Aufenthalts in der Montfortstadt für den Feldkircher Anzeiger geschrieben.
Tell us about the Feldkirchian Gazette. What is it? How many were there? What sort of things did it include?
Die von Conan Doyle herausgegebene Publikation The Feldkirchian Gazette war eine zum Nutzen seiner englischsprachigen Kommilitonen gegründete Schülerzeitung, wie Conan Doyle später in einem langen Übersichtsartikel zu seinem bisherigen Werdegang selber zu Protokoll gab. Die Zeitung war in englischer Sprache und sollte monatlich erscheinen. In jenem Übersichtsartikel verriet uns Conan Doyle aber auch, dass seiner Feldkirchian Gazette ein kurzes und wechselvolles Leben beschieden war und sie ein vorzeitiges Ende fand. Mit anderen Worten im Klartext, seine Schülerzeitung wurde, entgegen seinen Plänen, wohl auf Anweisung der Schulleitung eingestellt. Konkret sind von der Zeitung lediglich 2 Ausgaben im Nachlass der Familie erhalten geblieben, Oktober und November 1875, von der Novemberausgabe sogar nur die ersten 15 Seiten, und zwar als handschriftliches Originalmanuskript von Conan Doyle, welches heute in der British Library London verwahrt wird. Ich vermute, dass nach diesen 2 Ausgaben keine weiteren mehr folgten. Die Oktoberausgabe enthält 10 Beiträge, deren 7 von Conan Doyle stammen und 3 von 2 anderen Autoren. Von der fragmentarischen Novemberausgabe sind 5 Beiträge erhalten, wobei nur einer davon nicht von Conan Doyle stammt. Von diesen insgesamt 15 Beiträgen stammen also deren 11 von Conan Doyle, wovon er alle bis auf einen in gereimter Gedichtform verfasst hat. Viele der Beiträge handeln von Schulsituationen, manch eine in kritischer Form. Wiederholt geht es um Sport, etwa um Fußball oder Cricket. Übrigens, am Jesuitengymnasium Stella Matutina in Feldkirch wurde überhaupt erstmals in Österreich Fußball gespielt, wegen der englischen Jungs, die den Sport hierher brachten. In den Beiträgen geht es zum Beispiel auch um eine angsterfüllte Notenverlesung, um Aufbegehren gegen die Obrigkeit oder um das von Conan Doyle in der Schulblaskapelle gespielte und von ihm heiß geliebte Bombardon, eine Art Basstuba. Ganz besonders verblüfft hat mich, mit welch raffinierter und abgeklärter Souveränität, ja Brillanz, der damals erst 16-jährige Schüler Conan Doyle in einigen seiner Texte literarische Vorlagen der von ihm bewunderten Autoren Sir Walter Scott und Lord Thomas Babington Macaulay parodiert. Aus einer Schlacht bei Scott wird zum Beispiel ein hart umkämpftes Fußballspiel. Allein das zeigte schon das große, in dem Jungen schlummernde literarische Potenzial. In diesem Zusammenhang möchte ich noch erwähnen, dass Conan Doyle in Feldkirch auch quasi ein literarisches Erweckungserlebnis hatte, indem der Junge hier erstmals ein Buch von Edgar Allan Poe in die Hände bekam, das ihn nicht nur beeindruckte, sondern elektrisierte, nämlich Tales of Mystery, Imagination and Humor. In späteren Jahren gestand Conan Doyle, kein Autor außer Macaulay und Scott habe seinen Geschmack oder seine literarische Neigung so sehr geprägt wie Poe. Einen seiner Beiträge, jenen mit dem Titel A Feldkirch Drama, versieht Conan Doyle übrigens sogar mit eigenhändigen, den Text illustrierenden Cartoons. Auch möchte ich an dieser Stelle noch auf ein Kuriosum hinweisen. Auf der Titelseite der Novemberausgabe seiner Schülerzeitung rechts oben hatte Conan Doyle die sogenannte dritte binomische Formel notiert, wohl nur als Gedankenstütze, denn es ist nicht anzunehmen, dass er das handschriftliche Manuskript seiner Zeitung mit in den Mathematikunterricht nahm, um es als Spickzettel zu benutzen. Die notierte Formel mag aber vielleicht auch jenen harten Kampf symbolisieren, den Conan Doyle in Feldkirch mit den Tücken der Mathematik und der Logik führte. Aber die eingehende Beschäftigung mit der Logik an der Stella würde schließlich auch seinen Geist schärfen für jene besonderen deduktiven Fähigkeiten, welche seinen späteren Romanhelden, den Detektiv Sherlock Holmes, geradezu charakterisieren.
Of Conan Doyle's many contributions to the Gazette, which do you think are the most important and why?
Zunächst einmal sein allererstes Gedicht in der Oktoberausgabe, in dem er uns gleich einen programmatischen Ausblick für sein Projekt liefert und ankündigt, mit der Gazette in trostloser Zeit und inmitten lauter Wogen der wütenden See zu trotzen und uns Monat für Monat mit ihrem Licht zu erheitern. Gleich danach folgt mit dem Gedicht Verses eine Parodie auf die Ballade Lays of Ancient Rome des von ihm verehrten Dichters Thomas Macaulay. Darin wird Conan Doyles realer Schulfreund Wilfrid Edward Lomax als Torhüter zum Held auf dem Fußballfeld. In seinem Gedicht A Horrible Tale lässt der erst 16-jährige Conan Doyle bereits eine Prise seines dramatischen Talents aufblitzen, indem er den Leser zunächst auf eine falsche Fährte lockt, um ihn am Schluss mit einer überraschenden Wendung zu verblüffen. das Ganze versetzt mit einer gewissen Prise frechen britischen Humors. Ein Schlüsselbeitrag ist wohl auch jener über eine Notenverlesung, The Readings of the Notes, in dem sich ein Mitschüler von Conan Doyle über einen Jesuitenpater namens Pipes und dessen angsteinflößendes Gebaren lustig macht. In Conan Doyles letzten Beitrag der Oktoberausgabe To Contributors wendet er sich dankend an seine Mitarbeiter, ermuntert sie zum Weitermachen, auf das sie mit der Gazette ein Zeugnis englischer Zivilisation liefern mögen. Ich zitiere: in diesem wilden, fremden Land. Schon sehr bald würde sich Conan Doyle aber anfreunden mit diesem wilden, fremden Land, bekannte er doch in seinen Memoiren hinsichtlich der Stella Matutina im Rückblick, ich zitiere: hier waren die Bedingungen viel humaner und ich begegnete weit mehr Menschenliebe als in Stonyhurst, mit dem sofortigen Ergebnis, dass ich aufhörte, ein nachtragender junger Rebell zu sein und zu einem Hüter von Recht und Ordnung wurde. Auch seine berühmte Romanfigur Sherlock Holmes sollte ja dereinst zum Hüter von Recht und Ordnung werden. Einen absoluten Höhepunkt von Conan Doyles Texten bildet für mich seine Introduction in die zweite Ausgabe der Gazette vom November, die nichts weniger ist als ein flammendes Bekenntnis zur Pressefreiheit. Und das vor 150 Jahren von einem gerade einmal 16-jährigen schottischen Jungen. Manch einer der irrlichternden, machtbesessenen Politiker unserer Tage könnte sich an ihm ein Beispiel nehmen. In seinem Gedicht A Feldkirch Football Match parodiert Conan Doyle in gekonnter Weise den historischen Versroman Marmion, A Tale of Flodden Field, des von ihm hochverehrten Schöpfers von Ivanhoe, Sir Walter Scott. Wie schon gesagt, wird hier aus einem Kampf auf dem Schlachtfeld ein hart umkämpftes Fußballspiel. Einer meiner Lieblingstexte von Conan Doyle in seiner Gazette ist aber The Song of the Bombarden, ein Lobgesang auf das von ihm in der Stella Blaskapelle mit Begeisterung gespielte Bombardon, eine Art großer Basstuba.
Now, you've managed to find out a lot about Father Baumgartner, who we've mentioned several times on the podcast. Tell us a little about him. How significant do you feel he was on Conan Doyle's development as a person and as an author?
Conan Doyle beschrieb seinen 7-jährigen Aufenthalt im englischen Jesuitenkonvikt Stonyhurst, bevor er nach Feldkirch kam, im Rückblick als eine überaus unglückliche Zeit. Erst im letzten Schuljahr 1874/75 blühte er auf, als er plötzlich seine besondere literarische Begabung entdeckte. In jenem Jahr war auch der literarisch hochgebildete und für seinen Humor allseits bekannte Jesuitenpater Alexander Baumgartner als Lehrer für neuere Sprachen, Deutsch, Italienisch und Französisch, an die Schule gekommen. Wie Conan Doyle in einem Brief an seine Mutter Mary berichtete, gefiel ihm der Deutschunterricht bei Pater Baumgartner sehr. Wie sehr lässt sich daran ermessen, dass Conan Doyle seinen vormaligen Deutschlehrer Baumgartner später in 3 seiner Erzählungen als Baumgarten verewigte. Eine Ehre, die meines Wissens keinem anderen seiner ehemaligen Lehrer zuteil wurde. Pater Baumgartner stammte aus dem an Vorarlberg angrenzenden Schweizer Kanton St. Gallen und war, wie auch sein berühmter Vater und hoher Politiker Gallus Jakob Baumgartner, Bürger der an Feldkirch angrenzenden Schweizer Stadt Altstetten. Feldkirch und Altstetten sind übrigens die einzigen aneinander grenzenden Städte aus Österreich und der Schweiz. Vor allem aber war Pater Baumgartner zuvor selber Zögling, also Schüler, und später Lehrer des Jesuitengymnasiums Stella Matutina gewesen, welches er lebenslang in bester Erinnerung behielt. Meines Wissens war damals Pater Baumgartner auch der einzige Lehrer in Stonyhurst mit einer persönlichen Verbindung zur Stella Matutina. Deshalb liegt es nahe, dass Pater Baumgartner es war, der dem Stonyhurster Rektor Purbrick vorschlug, dem begabten Schüler Conan Doyle zu empfehlen, nach Abschluss seiner Gymnasialzeit in Stonyhurst noch für ein Schuljahr an die Stella Matutina in Feldkirch zu gehen, um dort seine Deutschkenntnisse zu verbessern. Pater Baumgartner dürfte Conan Doyle aber auch deshalb beeindruckt haben, weil er nicht nur über ein breit gefächertes literarisches Wissen aus mehreren Sprachräumen verfügte, sondern auch mit dem engeren Familienkreis von Sir Walter Scott in freundschaftlicher Verbindung stand. Was Conan Doyle damals natürlich noch nicht ahnen konnte, ist, dass sein vormaliger Deutschlehrer Baumgartner später eine auf 10 Bände angelegte Geschichte der Weltliteratur herausgeben und zur unbestrittenen literarischen Autorität der katholischen Kirche, dem sogenannten katholischen Literaturpapst, aufsteigen würde, und dass man seinen Lehrer sogar 3-mal für den Literaturnobelpreis nominieren würde. Mit Conan Doyle und Baumgartner waren also in Stonyhurst 2 Menschen aufeinander getroffen, welche sich in ihrem späteren Leben beide zu weltweiten Koryphäen auf ihrem Gebiet entwickeln sollten. Ich bin überzeugt, dass die Begegnung von Conan Doyle mit seinem Deutschlehrer Baumgartner in Stonyhurst für ihn als Person und seine weitere literarische Laufbahn entscheidend und wegweisend war.
We're really pleased to be able to host the English language version of your article on the website, but where can listeners find your other scholarship?
Über das Schuljahr von Conan Doyle in Feldkirch habe ich ausführlich in meinem 2018 erschienenen Buch Das literarische Feldkirch berichtet. Conan Doyles Schülerzeitung The Feldkirchian Gazette habe ich 2024 in der Zeitschrift Montfort des Vorarlberger Landesarchivs vollständig veröffentlicht, meines Wissens erstmals. Dass mir das vollständige Manuskript der Gazette von der British Library zur Verfügung gestellt wurde, verdanke ich Markus Geiser und seiner Gattin Helen Dorey. Des Weiteren habe ich verschiedentlich in Zeitungsartikeln über Conan Doyle publiziert.
Philip, thank you so much for your time.